Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 145 review. As usual, I'll give the general overview. Harpreet will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jovi on the platform. So this sprint, we saw a market spike upward in both PRs merged and opened this sprint. I attribute that to two things. One is there were a set of PRs to update each provider repo with plugin generator changes, but probably more importantly, there are a number of new people from IBM who are contributing to the project, and I think most of that contribution is coming from them. In terms of the split of the PRs, it's still a 50-50 split, roughly, between bugs and enhancements. And the code health, here's the update for Sprint 145. And with that, I will turn it over to Harpreet.
Thanks, Oleg. Hello, everyone. Total of 22 PRs were merged in UI repos. Out of that, 7 were bug fixes, 4 enhancements, and some dependencies PRs. We did not have any major enhancements this sprint to show, but I have some bug fixes that I'll go over on the next few slides. Next slide, please. An issue was fixed in toolbars on VM or instance summary screens. In some cases, access button group was disabled, causing user not to be able to get to the HTML console button. So that got fixed, as you can see in this before and after slides here. Next slide, please.
Can you see that?
I thought there was a slide before this one.
There you go.
Yeah, so on the new React forms, the information popover was hidden behind navigation menus. So that was fixed by Martin H. during the sprint. Slide, please. Screens such as a provider summary screens have 2 state toolbar buttons to toggle between textual details and a dashboard view. Even though the button looked disabled, it was still clickable. So with the fix during the sprint, it's now disabled and cannot be clicked. Next slide, please. An issue was fixed on summary screens in the smart management box, even though the rows with classification tags info is not clickable, but it still had a hand pointer on those. That was confusing for the users, so that got fixed. And that's all I have for the UI.
Thanks, Harpreet. So for providers this sprint, core changes, we had an update to the EMS event refresh targets method that Dan did. We found that if a provider supported graph refresh and used the general event target parsing, but it didn't support targeted refresh, this was failing because it was trying to instantiate a class that didn't exist. So now Dan's checking the provider settings to see if it supports targeted refresh before trying to instantiate that event target parser class. Then across almost all of the providers, we had a lot of changes across the board. David updated the provider create params to update to DDF v2. We also fixed a number of places where dynamic parameters in the create params were cached. And so if you try to re-add the provider, the changes would not be picked up. So for example, if you change settings in the Kubernetes provider, or if you're on OpenStack and you created an OpenStack provider, further subsequent additions wouldn't pick up the changes because they were cached. So now we're not caching any params that have dynamic values. We also updated VCR cassettes for the new REST client 2.1.0. They're using some built-in compression from the HTTP gem, so they don't do their own gzip compression, which changed what the values for the VCR spec tests were. So We're now up to REST Client 2.1, which is the current one, and all the providers that use REST Client have their VCRs updated. Next slide. For Google, we also updated to the latest Fog Google Gem. The REST client change is one of the things that was preventing us from getting there. So we also had to update the VCRs, not just for REST client, but also just for Fog Google. Their APIs changed a little bit, so we had to re-record the VCRs for that. On the IBM Cloud side, we fixed a problem in the parser where their API is returning disks in gigabytes, but ManageIQ is expecting them in bytes. So it was a pretty easy change to the disk and to the volume parser. And then we also the sprint added a lot of specs to the VM classes and the Cloud Manager classes. So these were the first PRs from these two developers, and obviously adding specs is great. So we really appreciate that. For IBM Terraform, we're collecting IaaS VMs as configured systems, which is a change from before. And then we're also cross-linking configured systems with VMs that might have been discovered from other providers. So the IBM Terraform API returns the unique ID for the system, and we're trying to link up configured systems that are discovered by this provider. You know, if you have an Amazon or a VMware provider, add it to ManageIQ that you're provisioning into. We'll cross-link those configured systems with VMs discovered from those providers' refresh. Next slide. On OpenStack, Marek fixed an issue with volume auto-delete option when you're provisioning a VM. The format from the parameters that were being sent down from the UI changed, and so this is always defaulting to false, even if you selected it to true, so we fixed that up. For Overt, Dan also checked the different name in the VM process list. Depending on the version of RHEL or CentOS that you're using, this guest agent can have a different name. So we were only looking at the ones from RHEL 6 and 7. RHEL 8 changed the name, so now we're looking at that as well, so that we'll set the VM's guest tools status appropriately. For VMware, we found that if your vCenter's time is way off from actual time, provisions can fail because we're trying to match up when the inventory is at least as new as the VM clone task completion time. We're using time.now on the ManageIQ server for the inventory time, and the tasks completion time comes from the vCenter. So for example, the vCenter is 6 hours in the future. We're essentially waiting 6 hours to notice that inventory is up to date. So we're now checking as part of credential refresh to let the user know if their vCenter's time is not accurate. We fixed an issue with targeted refresh of distributed virtual port groups. If you deleted a DV port group, we weren't actually deleting it from VMDB, so we fixed that and added some specs for it. We found that Vim strings were getting serialized to notifications accidentally.
Adam, we lost your audio. Adam? Can anybody else hear me?
Look, yeah, it looks like he's on mute.
No, he's been having problems with BlueJeans. I think we can just.
Yeah, so I think we'll jump over to the next section, and
Yep.
Everybody can read the other two items that he didn't get to. Turn it over to Joe.
Sure. So 14 PRs were merged in the platform-based sprint. There were a couple of noteworthy enhancements. One is Kafka is now included in the build, and the Laravel backups of listed volumes has been enabled. There are a couple of noteworthy bugs. One was fixed where edits to an embedded Ansible credentials were not being correctly stored. And another bug was addressed where the OpenID Connect SHM cache was undersized for most installations, causing authentication failures. And those are the highlights for the platform space.
Ready. Thank you. All right, and that concludes the Sprint 145 review. The next one is in 2 weeks, the next Sprint review. And I want to thank everyone, the speakers, the contributors, and the whole community for helping us have another successful Sprint. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next time.